So continuing where I left off, some of the cons of polls, if they're used a certain way by politicians, is that, depending on how politicians are feeling or how bold they are, then it can really discourage true leadership. There's lots of things in when it comes to leading a school or leading a community or, leading a nation that are not going to be popular, but they need to happen, right? Like shutting down the country during COVID was not like anybody's favorite thing, right? And if we had polled people, right, people might have said, "No way, it's going to be terrible. I hate it." But sometimes you need real leadership to kind of fix problems. And if you're always kind of responding to poll numbers or obsessing over poll numbers, then it's really easy to kind of fall into a place where you don't do what needs to happen. If you were to put this in history, right, like the Constitution was historically very unpopular at the time it was ratified. The purchase of Alaska for what was $7.3 million, right? Less money than some houses over by the Broadmoor, right? The entire state of Alaska, which now has a crazy amount of oil and diamonds and gold and all sorts of different things. Louisiana Purchase, right? What was essentially half of our nation was not popular at the time, right? But people, politicians, right? They stepped up and they did something that they believed needed to be done, and they led, right? And they didn't look at what the public was wishing. Now, I'm not saying that politicians should ignore public perception, but only that it can be a con of how polls can impact democracy by, discouraging leadership, right? And making people um I don't know, feel like I can't possibly do this thing that I think needs to happen because everybody hates it. Um, now, another con that we look at here is that polls can weaken democracy. If we start to see, and we see this bandwagoning effect, and maybe you saw it last year in psychology, but if you start to feel like everybody really wants some so and so, or everybody likes this candidate, or everybody is supporting this issue, right? Then we start to get this bandwagon effect where people start to be like, well, if everybody thinks it's a good idea, I guess I'm going to get in on that too. And, that's not really what we want in an informed democracy. We want people to, debate and challenge each other, and we want the best ideas to win. And sometimes polls, particularly if they're poorly done and shared on Facebook and with giant margin of errors and all sorts of flawed sampling techniques, that this can really weaken democracy as it can have an influence how other people act. And then I think the other thing, and this was kind of what I was getting at with poor sampling techniques, is that sometimes, and a lot of Americans are not smart enough, or maybe smart enough is too negative, savvy, not savvy enough to pick up on this, is that the how a question is worded to people can have a huge impact on the outcome. I already said Obamacare polls significantly less popular than the Affordable Care Act. Another good example of this, right, is when we say, "Do you support gay marriage?" It polls very well, right? Like a lot of most of Americans have really moved in that direction, and an overwhelming number of Americans say, "Yes, I do support the right of gay citizens to get married," right? But if you change one word and you say, "Do you support homosexual marriage?" right? What is essentially the exact same thing plummets in terms of polling. And so we want to be conscious, like consumers of polls, and look at what was the question, how was it asked? What are your sampling techniques? What's the margin of error built into the poll, right? And then after giving it a really hard sniff, you can decide whether it's crap or whether it's really legitimately informative. Continuing on, we want to talk about some other polls, and this is one that we're about to see coming up in just a couple weeks now, which is the exit poll. Now, the exit poll is going to be far less reliable than normal this year because of COVID and the fact that most people are voting by mail-in ballot. But what we see in election exit or election day exit polls, particularly if you've ever watched election night returns, how the heck is an entire state like New York or Pennsylvania or Michigan, how are they able to call an election and tell you the state of New York is going for Joe Biden, right? By like 10 o'clock p.m. on election day. There's no way they've counted those millions of votes, right? And so what they do, right, is they use exit polls to make a really statistically pretty sound um, you know, what I'm really stumbling over my words here. I'm sorry, you guys. A really like pretty strong assumption of what the poll or what the results are going to be. And so, these are by poll workers who basically hang outside of election day voting precincts, generally in, very key areas. So, like you would have election exit or an exit poll in, if you're talking about Ohio, in major important precincts in Cleveland, and then you'd have them in Cincinnati, and you'd have them in Columbus, and you have them in important suburbs, and basically you have pollsters who hang outside the um, voting booths, and as you come out, they say, "Excuse me, miss, would you like to tell us like who you voted for?" And, basically, if you can do this right and you can truly get a random sample, um, then you can start to see patterns that emerge. If you can get a large enough sample and you do it randomly, you hang outside for 7 hours all day, and let's say you ask every fifth person that comes out, right? So everyone has an equal chance of being selected. Every fifth person, you go up to them and you say, "Sir, I'm doing an exit poll. Would you mind telling me who you voted for?" Um, if they do that, you can get a pretty good sense of what the state or what the area is going to go for, right? And like that's used all the time to be able to make, draw conclusions about what's about to happen. Now, there are problems for this, though, right? And so, as I said, ask every 10th person or fifth person or whatever. This is how you get a random sample. But the drawback, and we've seen this in real life historically, um, we've seen it in the sense that there's a major time difference in our country, right? And so, a lot of times, if you're talking about Hawaii or you're talking about Alaska or you're talking about California and West Coast states, if you historically, and it probably won't happen this year because of COVID, and it didn't happen in 2016. It called it a little bit later, but in 2008, for example, the Obama presidency, they called it for Obama by like what 7 o'clock when I was living in Oregon. I think at 7 o'clock they had called the election and said, President or Barack Obama wins the presidency. Now, here's the thing though, right? Polls oftentimes don't close till 8 o'clock in places like California or, um, Oregon or Hawaii. It's even later, and so as we look here, if you're getting results being broadcast on television saying this just in, we're calling the election for, um, you know, Joe Biden, um, and let's say you're a person in California who has to get a babysitter or is, just getting off of work and you're really tired, but you were going to go vote, but you hear on the radio, "Oh, Joe Biden won." Suddenly it's like, well, maybe I'll just go home. He's already won. Like I don't need to vote. And the problem with that is it has huge impact on what we call down ballot races. Because if let's say I live in California and I would have voted for Biden, but I found out when as I was getting off work and about to go vote that he had already won, and I say I'm just going to go home. Well, there's a strong likelihood that when I went in to vote for Joe Biden, I would also vote for the other 10 races on the ballot and other Democrats, right? I might vote for a Democratic senator, a Democratic mayor, a Democratic House of Representative member. And so suddenly, by me just being like, "Oh, I already won, I guess I'll just go home," then I'm not casting my votes for any of those people either, which can have huge negative impacts. And we've seen this particularly in 1984 and 1996 where time zones had a huge like interaction with exit polling results. Where in 1996 they pretty much knew that Bill Clinton won by like 6 o'clock, right? Basically, soon as polls closed in Pennsylvania, which was like 7 o'clock, they knew that Bill Clinton was going to pick up the necessary electoral votes to win the presidency. And so if you think of 7 o'clock in Pennsylvania, that's 4 o'clock in California, in Oregon, in Washington, in Nevada, and all these other states. And so suddenly all these, Democratic Clinton voters didn't go to the polls, and Republicans ended up doing very well in Western states because exit polling data discouraged people from actually showing up to vote. And these are what I mean when I say down ballot votes. So maybe some of you have seen the ballots this year. This is the one from 2012. Um, you can see the president and vice president federal office was first, but everything below them is considered a down ballot race. So the U.S. senators, U.S. House of Representatives members, these are all down ballot races. So, what do polls reveal about America's political information, right? And what do political scientists know about Americans in general level of political awareness, or political knowledge? So, let's take a look at my Calvin and Hobbes thing. Is it a right to remain ignorant? I don't know, but I refuse to find out, right? And so, this gets at kind of what we're talking about here in this particular slide, which is that political scientists know for a fact that the Americans public, or the American public's knowledge about politics is extremely low, right? Like if you were to go into the streets in Colorado Springs and just randomly ask people, who's the mayor of Colorado Springs, or name the two senators for Colorado, or who's your U.S. House of Representatives member, the vast majority of people do not know the answer to these questions. You are not going to be these people, right? Who are the two senators? Well, right now it's Cory Gardner and Michael Bennet. Cory Gardner is up for re-election, though. Could be John Hickenlooper and Michael Bennet. Who's our mayor? It's Mayor Suthers. Who is our House of Representatives member? It's Doug Lamborn, right? Who's the current Secretary of State? Well, that's Mike Pompeo, right? And so, but the average American does not know these things, and and the problem with this is, and we see this particularly in 2020 and 2016, which is as social media has gained in power, there has been enormous misinformation out there, right? And there's been congressional hearings looking how the Russians are basically impacting our elections by spreading misinformation. Um, but it's gotten worse, right? Because Americans' political knowledge is so generally low, it makes us incredibly vulnerable to misinformation campaigns, which is really why I argued so vehemently to get a government class for the entire senior group, not just an AP government class, but every senior should have government, right? At least as a start, right? People need to know stuff. You can't be a sheep your whole life, right? And so misinformation has become increasingly detrimental with every election cycle as social media influence rises. Um, and, we don't know a lot of things, not just about us, but about the world. We don't know what candidates believe. We know what we think they believe based on, I saw what my Uncle Mark was talking about and sharing on Facebook, or, I saw this one attack ad saying that he, hates babies and kills babies. But, so I assume that he's a baby killer, right? But we don't actually know what the candidates' positions are. Um, and so, this is a problem, right? And the fact of the matter is that most people are found through political scientists have polled this to find how do you make your decisions, that most members of the American public are single issue voters. They have one issue they care about more than others, right? For your generation, I know a lot of you know Atlas alumni, it's climate change, right? Or maybe it's the Black Lives Matter movement, and where do you stand on that? Or for some religious conservatives, it's reproductive health care choices and abortion. Maybe it's the environmental laws. But what we find is that most Americans have a single important issue, and it has an enormous impact on who they support, right? Now, if we look here, they're also kind of making their decisions, generally speaking, on how satisfied they are with what's going on right now. So I might actually like the president's positions on a lot of things, but I lost my job a couple months ago. I'm broke. My general perception is that everything sort of sucks, right? Like I'm going to vote against this guy, even though I actually agree with most of the things he liked, because I'm not very satisfied with the job that government is doing in general, right? And there's been a lot of famous losses throughout history where Jimmy Carter, for example, was an extraordinarily popular man, but he was, president during a major economic crisis in the Iran-Contra deal. This is where we'll pick up on Friday.